The sky over the Stillwater Mountains didn't just get dark. It cracked open like a sheet of scorched parchment, letting a strange ash-colored snow fall through the dusk. The world was going quiet, burying itself for the winter. And through that silence, one man walked. His name was Taza, but the folks down in the valley didn't call him that anymore. They called him Ghost Elk. Half man, half myth, a whisper that drifted down from the high ridges. He moved with the slow, steady gait of a man who had nowhere to be and no one waiting for him. The world had stopped speaking to Taza a long time ago. It went silent the day they carved his brother's name into a cold slab of army stone, and it had stayed silent ever since. The whispers in the town below turned his shadow into a legend. Some said he'd fought a whole cavalry troop with nothing but a rock. Others claimed he consorted with wolves and buried the bones of forgotten men. Taza never corrected them. He knew that truth, like smoke, just made most men choke. He was heading for his cave, a place carved into the ancient rock where the wind couldn't reach him. By the time he got there, night had fallen like a black sheet, and the soft snow was kissing the ground, hushing everything. But as he reached the threshold, he stopped. He tilted his head, his nostrils flaring. The air was wrong. He could smell it. The scent of a dying fire, but it wasn't his. And something else. The smell of wet wool and fear. Slowly, silently, he unslung the cedar bundle from his back, his fingers brushing against the cold steel of the hatchet tucked in his belt. He was ready for anything. A cornered fox, a desperate thief, maybe even a mountain lion. He slipped through the narrow stone entrance, his body a shadow within the greater darkness, ready to confront whatever had invaded his sanctuary. But what he found inside made him freeze, his breath catching in his throat. It wasn't an animal, and it wasn't a thief. There, curled on the hard stone floor near the dead coals of his fire pit, was a girl. She was pale as a ghost, her skin almost glowing in the faint light filtering in from outside. Her dress, which might have been a rich, velvety blue once, was now tattered and shredded at the hem, soaked through with melted snow. A single satin slipper clung to one of her feet, a sad, lonely thing. The other foot was bare, the heel cracked open and crusted with dried blood. She hadn't woken at his approach. She just trembled, a slight constant shudder, like a tree branch that had been battered by the wind for far too long. A thick, heavy cloak was draped over her, but it was too big, ill-fitting, the collar stitched with a rough, masculine thread. It wasn't hers. Taza stood there for a long moment, just watching. He took in her shallow breaths, the dark, bruised ring around one of her wrists, the streak of soot on her cheek. This was not a woman who was used to sleeping on cold stone. She smelled of things that didn't belong in his world: saddle leather, expensive silk, and the raw, sharp scent of terror. He moved closer, his steps making no sound on the dusty floor. He knelt beside her and gently, so gently, placed the back of his hand on her forehead. She was burning with fever. At his touch, she stirred. A low moan escaped her lips, not quite a word, just a sound of pure misery. Her eyelashes fluttered, and then her eyes opened. They were a stormy, haunted gray, rimmed with red. They stared up at him, unfocused, clouded with delirium and pain. She didn't scream, she didn't recoil, she just rasped out 5 words that hit him harder than any physical blow. "Please," she whispered, her voice like cracking ice. "Don't take me back." And then, just as quickly as she had surfaced, she slipped away again, her eyes closing, her body going limp as she fell back into the depths of unconsciousness. Taza stayed kneeling there for a long time, the girl's desperate plea echoing in the sudden, profound silence of the cave. The wind howled outside, a lonely, mournful sound that seemed to shake the very bones of the mountain. "Don't take me back." Back where? And back to whom? The questions hung in the air, cold and sharp as icicles. He looked down at her fragile form, at the clues scattered around her like pieces of a puzzle he didn't want to solve. The fancy dress, the ill-fitting man's cloak, the bruise on her wrist that looked suspiciously like a handprint. This wasn't a simple case of a traveler lost in a storm. This was something else entirely. This was a cage that had been broken, and its bird had flown right into his sanctuary. He let out a slow breath through his nose. He could leave her. Let the fever and the cold do their work. It would be easier, safer. The world had taught him that compassion was a liability, a weakness that others would exploit. But as he looked at her face, pale and vulnerable in the growing dark, he saw something else. He saw a reflection of his own flight, his own desperate search for a place where the ghosts couldn't find him. With a quiet grunt, he made his decision. He carefully lifted her into his arms. She was shockingly light, no more than a sack of grain. He carried her over to his own sleeping furs, laying her down gently. Then he turned to the dead fire pit. He stacked fresh cedar logs into the blackened circle of stones, coaxing a tiny spark from his flint and steel. He fed the spark with dry tinder, blowing on it with a steady, patient breath until a small flame flickered to life. The fire caught, growing, blooming in the darkness, licking at the cold stone as if it had a personal vendetta against the chill. As the light grew, it illuminated her features more clearly. She had high cheekbones and elegantly arched brows. There was a pride in the line of her jaw, even slack as it was with exhaustion. Her hair, which must have been pinned up in some intricate style, had fallen loose. It was the color of spun gold, now smudged with soot and cinders, turning it the color of dying embers. He warmed some water in a battered tin canteen and dampened a cloth. With methodical care, he began to wipe the grime from her face and hands. Her hands were soft, but there were calluses in strange places. Not the rough hands of a rancher's daughter, but not the pampered, untouched hands of a wealthy lady either. It was as if her life story was caught somewhere in between, still struggling to decide which direction to take. He cleaned the wound on her foot, wrapping it in clean strips of linen and soft rabbit fur he kept for lining his boots. Her breath hitched at his touch, a sharp intake of air. But she didn't wake. When he was done, he settled on the far side of the fire, pulling his own blanket around his shoulders. He didn't try to sleep. He just sat and watched her, the firelight dancing in his dark, unreadable eyes. And as the night wore on, he began to hum. A low, steady tune his grandmother used to sing, a song without words that spoke of snow and survival, and the stubborn warmth that refuses to die. Morning came slowly, a pale gray light that crept into the cave like a thief. The fire had burned down to glowing embers, casting a soft, orange light on the stone walls. The girl's eyes fluttered open. For a moment, there was only confusion. Then, as her surroundings came into focus, the cave, the fire, the silent man sitting across from her, panic flared in her eyes. She tried to sit up, a sharp gasp of pain escaping her as she put weight on her injured foot. She fell back against the furs, her breath coming in ragged bursts. Taza was already crouched by the fire, stirring something in a dented tin pot. He didn't look at her immediately. He just kept stirring, the scrape of the spoon against the metal, the only sound in the cave. "You!" Her voice was a cracked, fearful whisper. Where am I?" He finally looked up, his eyes meeting hers. They were dark and deep, and she couldn't read a single thing in them. He didn't speak. He just gave the pot one last stir, then poured the thick, steaming stew into a carved wooden bowl. He held it out to her. She hesitated, her eyes darting around the cave, as if searching for an escape route, for some sign of a trap. But there were no ropes, no bars. She was alone with him, but she wasn't a prisoner, and she was starving. With a trembling hand, she took the bowl. She ate in silence, the hot stew warming her from the inside out. It was simple food, jerked meat, wild roots, but it tasted like the finest meal she'd ever had. When she was finished, she licked the bowl clean, a faint flush of embarrassment coloring her cheeks. "I'm Nora," she said finally, her voice a little steadier now. "Nora Lee." Taza just gave a single slow nod. No flicker of surprise or disbelief crossed his face. It was as if he'd been expecting her to say something, anything. She glanced towards the mouth of the cave, where the pale morning light was spilling in. "I'll go as soon as I can stand. I didn't mean to intrude." Still, he said nothing. He simply reached over and added another piece of cedar to the fire. The flames leaped up, casting dancing shadows on his stoic face, answering for him. Her gaze softened. A flicker of something other than fear entered her eyes. "You could have just left me out there," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "You could have let me die." He looked up at her then, his dark eyes seeming to see right through her. "Snow don't care who you are," he said, his voice deep and gravelly from disuse. "Only whether you stop moving." She blinked, taken aback by the simple, brutal truth of his words. That day passed in a slow, quiet rhythm, the way winter days always do. Nora tried to stand a few times, but her ankle buckled, and she fell back with a soft curse. She asked him questions he didn't answer. Where did he come from? Did he live up here all alone? Was there a road nearby? But she didn't press him. There was something about his silence that wasn't threatening. It felt earned, like a quiet he had fought for and won. That evening, as she sat by the fire, she tried to comb her fingers through her hopelessly tangled hair, wincing as she hit snags. Taza watched her struggle for a moment. Then he reached into a leather sack and pulled something out. It was a simple comb, carved from a piece of smooth, dark wood. He held it out to her. "Made it," he said, his first unsolicited words since she'd woken up. She took it from him, her fingers brushing his. The wood was warm, and she could feel the faint grooves left by the knife that had shaped it. "You carve?" she asked softly. He just nodded once. She began to comb her hair again, slower this time, the wooden teeth gliding through the tangles with surprising ease. "My father, he never let me do anything for myself," she said suddenly, her voice brittle, like something stretched too thin. "He said soft hands were a sign of good breeding." Taza didn't respond. He just added a pinch of dried herbs to the pot of water boiling over the fire. "I guess he never stopped to wonder if I wanted to be soft," she continued, her voice quieter now, almost talking to herself. "Or if I wanted to be anything at all." A different kind of silence settled between them then. It wasn't empty or awkward. It was a shared quiet, filled with unspoken things. Outside, the wind howled, rattling the pine branches against the rock. The fire cast their shadows long and dancing on the cave wall. Nora unconsciously rubbed her wrist, her eyes falling on the faint, yellowing bruise that still lingered there. "If he comes looking for me," she said, her voice dropping to a near whisper. "My father, I mean. If he comes, you should tell him you never saw me." He looked at her for a long time, his expression unreadable in the flickering light. Then he spoke, his voice low and firm. "I don't lie." Her face fell. Then don't speak at all," she whispered, a desperate plea in her eyes. They sat like that for a long while, the fire crackling between them. At one point, Nora dozed off, her head nodding forward. Taza watched her for a moment before getting up. He took another one of his thick blankets and gently draped it over her shoulders. His fingers brushed against the back of her hand, and for a second, he hesitated. Her hand, which had been clenched into a fist, relaxed at his touch, her palm turning upward in her sleep, as if an offering. He stared at it, a strange expression on his face, as if her simple, unconscious gesture had asked him a question he didn't know how to answer. Outside, the snow continued to fall, a thick white blanket covering the land, muffling the world in a deep and profound hush. Nothing more had been said between them, but something had shifted. It was like the first, almost imperceptible crack of thawing ice on a frozen river. You don't hear it coming, but you can feel the change in your bones. And Taza, for all his silence and his solitude, felt it too. A girl with cinders in her hair and a storm in her eyes had stumbled into his life. He had told himself he would let her stay one night. Just one. But he was beginning to understand that winter's hold, once it takes root, does not let go so easily. And ghosts, whether they were his or hers, did not always stay buried. The next morning, the snow had thinned to a misty, freezing drizzle. The world outside the cave was slick and glistening, the pine needles heavy with moisture. Nora woke to the smell of cedar smoke and something sweet and fragrant boiling in the tin pot over the fire. She found herself alone, but a folded blanket had been left at her feet, and next to it, a steaming tin cup of tea. It smelled of pine and wild mint, a scent that was both sharp and comforting. She held the hot cup in both hands, letting the warmth seep into her palms. The tea was strong and a little bitter, but it filled her with a heat the fire couldn't provide. She looked toward the mouth of the cave. The world outside looked like a watercolor painting, the colors bleeding into one another. It was beautiful, but desolate. A moment later, she heard footsteps. Taza appeared, his dark hair damp and pulled back from his face. He was carrying a freshly skinned rabbit and a pouch of smooth gray river stones. His gaze brushed past her, barely acknowledging her presence. She nodded a silent thank you for the tea. He nodded back. The silence between them felt different now. It was less of a wall and more of a space that allowed for quiet thoughts and unspoken grief. She wrapped the blanket tighter around her shoulders. "I know I said I'd leave," she began, her voice still raspy, "but I still can't walk properly. I tried." Taza glanced at her bandaged foot. "Storm hasn't cleared," he said, his voice a low rumble. "You stay." Her chin lifted a little. "And what do I owe you for this charity?" He didn't answer. He just handed her a strip of dried meat and turned back to tend the fire. She took the jerky and chewed on it slowly, the salty, smoky flavor filling her mouth. "I meant it," she said more forcefully this time. "I don't expect your kindness. I don't think I even deserve it." He tossed another log onto the coals, sending a shower of orange sparks up into the darkness of the cave. "You bleed," he said, his back still to her. "You breathe. That's enough." She stared at his broad back, stunned. "Not where I'm from," she murmured, so quietly he might not have heard. That evening, she insisted on helping him prepare their meal. She sat on a flat stone near the fire, snapping the ends off dried beans that he had stored from the autumn harvest. He sat across from her, a piece of flint in his hands, carefully chipping away at it with another stone. He was shaping one edge into a sharp arrowhead, the other into a duller, rounded blade for scraping hides. The repetitive, rhythmic tap-tap-tap of his work was a strangely comforting sound. "I lied," she said suddenly, her voice soft. She didn't look up from the beans in her lap. "About my name." He didn't pause in his work. The tapping continued, steady and even. "I told you it was Nora Lee. It's not. But I don't want you to know the other one." He tilted his head slightly, his eyes still fixed on the piece of flint. "I figure names don't mean much up here anyway," she added, a little defensively. "Not like they do down in Stillwater." He looked up then, his dark eyes meeting hers across the fire. "Up here," he said, his voice quiet but clear. "A name is what you carry, not what you're called." She managed a faint, sad smile. "Then maybe I'll carry yours for a while." Taza said nothing, but she thought she saw something soften in his expression, a flicker of something that wasn't pity but maybe understanding. The next few days fell into a routine. Nora's foot began to heal, and though she still limped, she refused to be idle. She helped with chores, folding his spare blankets, rinsing wild herbs, even stringing dried pine cones on a piece of twine to hang at the cave entrance. Something he told her would ward off curious coyotes. He watched her work without offering praise or criticism, but his silence now felt like permission. It felt like trust. One morning, she found him trying to mend a tear in the shoulder of his old buckskin vest. The needle he was using was clumsy, and his large fingers struggled with the delicate work. "Let me," she said, crouching beside him. "My mother taught me how to sew, when the servants weren't looking." He looked at her for a long moment, then handed her the vest without a word. She took it, and her fingers, now calloused in their own way, moved with a surprising deftness. She stitched the seam neatly, each thread pulled tight and even. Later that day, he went out to check his snares, leaving her alone in the cave. She found herself drawn to a small bundle that hung from a peg near his sleeping roll. It was a medicine bundle, a collection of small personal items tied together with sinew. There were beads, feathers, tiny animal bones, and one smooth black stone the size of her thumb. It felt incredibly intimate, like looking at the pages of a diary. She felt like she was looking at a map of his life, one scar at a time. When he returned, he found her staring at it. "I didn't touch it," she said quickly, guiltily. He set down the rabbit he'd caught and walked over to stand beside her. "What do they mean?" she asked, her voice a whisper. He didn't answer right away. He just stared at the bundle, his face a mask. "Each one," he said finally, his voice low, "is a thing I buried, or a thing I failed to." Her eyes went to the single black stone. "That one," she said, "the black one." His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "My brother," he said, his voice flat, his blood on Union snow. The air in the cave suddenly felt heavy, thick with ghosts. "I'm sorry," she whispered. I know what it's like, to lose a brother. I had one. He was much younger than me. He was always sickly." Her own voice grew distant. "He died when I was 15. No war took him. Just a fever that no one thought was important enough to treat." Taza gave a slow, deep nod. He understood that kind of loss, the kind that comes not from a bang, but from a deafening silence. That night, a profound shift occurred. Nora reached into the small, tattered bag she'd arrived with and pulled out the only thing of value she had left. It was a gold necklace, heavy and ornate. The pendant was a crest, a serpent biting its own tail. The chain was broken. "My father gave this to me for my 16th birthday," she said, her voice tight. "He said it meant I was a Vexley, that I had a place, a future." She stared at the gleaming gold in her palm. It always felt more like a collar. She stood up, walked to the fire, and knelt before it. Her face was set, determined. "I don't want to carry it anymore," she said, her voice ringing with sudden strength, and with a flick of her wrist, she tossed the necklace into the flames. The gold hissed, seeming to scream for a moment as the fire devoured it, melting it down until it was just another part of the crackling wood. The smell of scorched metal filled the cave, acrid and final. She didn't look away. She watched until the last trace of it was gone. Across the fire, Taza watched her. His dark eyes reflected the flames, not their heat, but their power to transform. Later, as she settled into her sleeping furs, he came over and laid the extra blanket over her, just as he had the nights before. But this time, when his hand brushed against hers, she didn't pretend to be asleep. She turned her palm upward, an open, deliberate invitation. He didn't take her hand, but he didn't pull away either. He let his fingers rest there for a long moment, a silent acknowledgement of the thing she had just burned away, and the new, unknown thing that was taking its place. Down in the valley, in the smoky confines of the Stillwater Saloon, a half-drunk mule skinner named Clem Posse was telling a story. He swore on his mother's grave that he'd been hunting grouse up in Ghost Elk's Canyon and had seen a woman's boot print in the snow. Said he'd followed the tracks for a while before they disappeared. Said they were too small and narrow for any Apache woman he'd ever seen. And besides, he slurred to the bartender, what kind of Apache woman wears a shoe with a place for a ribboned heel? He told this story to anyone who would buy him a drink. And in a town as small and hungry for gossip as Stillwater, that story grew legs. And then it grew teeth. Within a day, people weren't just whispering about a woman in the hills with the wild man. They were starting to wonder which woman. They were starting to put names to the shadow. And they were starting to wonder how long it would be before Baron Vexley, the richest and cruelest man in the territory, sent his dogs out sniffing for what was his. Up on the ridge, in a world that didn't care about rumors, Nora was learning to walk again. Her limp was almost gone, and with each steady step she took on the rocky trail outside the cave, she felt a little more of the old fear fall away. She no longer jumped at the sound of a coyote's howl. She hummed to herself as she cooked their simple meals. She braided pine needles into intricate little chains, just to keep her hands busy. But the shadows were still there. Sometimes, in the dead of night, Taza would see her sitting by the dying embers of the fire, just staring at her own hands, as if she could still feel the weight of invisible shackles. He saw the way she rubbed her wrist, even though the bruise had long since faded. He knew that some ropes leave scars on the soul long after they're cut from the skin. She watched him too. She watched the way he moved, with a silent grace that made him seem like a part of the mountain itself. She watched him carve small figures from scraps of wood when he couldn't sleep. A soaring bird, a bear's paw, a woman's long braid. She wondered if each carving was a memory, a piece of something he had lost. One morning, she saw him staring out over the valley, his expression grim. "You carve this land into your bones," she said, trying to lighten the mood. "You don't even leave footprints anymore." He turned to her, and for the first time, she saw the ghost of a smile touch his lips. "Footprints," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Invite following." His words were more prophetic than she could have known. That very same day, a man named Beau Finch swung down from his horse in front of Baron Vexley's sprawling estate. Beau was the kind of man who enjoyed the way the law seemed to bend and warp when a rich man's hands were doing the twisting. He was the Baron's instrument, his enforcer, and he was good at his job. "Got word," Beau said, not even bothering with pleasantries. He stood on the porch, his spurs jingling, a cruel smirk on his face. "Your daughter might not be as gone as you thought." The Baron, a man whose face looked like it was carved from granite, didn't even blink. He sat in a high-backed chair, his hands folded over a silver-headed cane. "Explain," he commanded, his voice clipped and cold. "They say ghost elks got company up in those hills, and it ain't the usual sort. They're saying it's a girl, soft-footed, they say, dressed all wrong for the mountains." "I don't pay you to bring me rumors, Beau," the Baron said, his voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. Beau's smirk widened. "No, sir. You pay me to bring you results." He leaned forward, his voice full of greasy confidence. "Don't you worry, Baron. I'll go up there myself. I'll bring you back the flame, not just the smoke." Back on the ridge, the sun was setting, painting the sky in fiery strokes of orange and purple. Nora and Taza sat by the fire, sharing a meal of wild onions and cornbread they had baked on a flat stone. "I should leave soon," Nora said softly, her voice barely audible over the crackling of the fire. Taza looked up from his food. He didn't look surprised. He looked like a man who had been waiting for this moment, a man who knew that all seasons must eventually come to an end. I could head south," she said, thinking aloud. "Maybe try for Texas. I could change my name again, start over." "You afraid he'll find you?" Taza asked, his voice quiet. She looked at him, her eyes wide and haunted in the firelight. "I know he will," she said, a shiver running down her spine. "He doesn't let things go, not things he considers his property, and especially not his daughter's." Taza gave a single, slow nod. He understood that kind of cruelty. He had seen it in the burnt-out homesteads and broken treaties of his own past. She reached out and touched the medicine bundle that still hung near the cave entrance. Her fingers lingered on a small, white bead she had added to it a few days earlier, a bead she had carved herself. "I lied to you again," she whispered, her voice thick with shame. "That first night. I said I didn't want you to take me back. The truth is, I think a part of me wanted to be found. I think I wanted to be punished. Taza put down the half-finished carving he'd been working on. He looked at her, his eyes full of a strange, quiet intensity. Then you came to the right place, he said, his voice low and steady. The hills judge quieter than men, but they judge longer. A startled laugh escaped her lips, quickly stifled, as if she wasn't sure she was allowed to find any humor in her own dark truth. Down in Stillwater, the whispers were turning into a roar. The story of the runaway girl had taken on a life of its own, wild, feral, a bad influence. The whispers said someone needed to go up there and put a stop to it, before her savagery started to infect the decent folk of the town. But not everyone was whispering. Imbel Trent, whose husband Daw owed his life to Taza, heard the rumors, and her face grew hard. As she walked home from the general store, she held her husband's hand a little tighter, her eyes scanning the dark, forbidding line of the hills, as if she were watching the sky for an approaching storm. By the end of the week, Taza had built a small lean-to of fir branches just outside the cave. Nora had insisted on helping, her hands now rough and capable. "I'm not made of glass," she'd said, brushing snow from her sleeves. "Let me build something before I have to tear it all down." "Go tomorrow," Taza said suddenly that evening. "Why tomorrow?" she asked, surprised. "Because tonight," he murmured, looking up at the sky. "The stars are close." They sat outside under the vast, star-dusted canopy, their shoulders almost touching, the silence between them comfortable and deep. The sky was a dizzying swirl of constellations, each one a tiny, distant fire. Nora began to sing, a soft, tentative melody. It was a lullaby she hadn't even known she remembered, the words thin and fragile like old lace. Taza's head turned sharply. He stared at her, and then, in his low, rumbling voice, he hummed the next line of the song. She stopped singing, her eyes wide with disbelief. How do you know that song?" "My mother," he said, his voice thick with a memory. "She sang it when the lightning was too loud." Nora stared at him, her heart pounding. "Mine sang it," she whispered, "when the house got too cold. The same words, the same tune, the same quiet hush passed down through generations, connecting two worlds that should have never touched." They sat in silence for a long time after that, the weight of the shared memory hanging between them. Then she turned to him, her voice a bare whisper in the vast stillness of the night. "Would you have burned my father's house down?" He didn't answer right away. He just watched the stars slide across the sky like slow-moving embers. "If I had known what was inside it," he said finally, his voice flat and hard. "Maybe." She turned away, blinking back sudden, hot tears. Taza stood up, took the blanket from his own shoulders, and draped it over hers. "You should sleep," he said gently. "The hill will speak tomorrow." She looked up at him, her face a pale oval in the starlight. "What will it say?" "That the wind's changing," he replied, his eyes scanning the darkness beyond their fire. "And footsteps are coming." He could feel it already, a change in the air, a subtle shift in the night's rhythm. Something was wrong. And far below them, in a dusty stable on the edge of town, Beau Finch was saddling 3 horses. He checked the loads on each one, fresh ammunition, extra rations, and 2 grim-faced men whose loyalty could be bought with a handful of coins. They would ride at first light, and the quiet hills were about to echo with the sound of a storm that could not be called back. The air the next morning tasted wrong. It was too still, too heavy. Even the crows were silent, hopping from branch to branch with a nervous energy, as if they sensed that something meaner than winter was waking up in the woods. Taza knew the sound of approaching hunters, even when they tried to walk like ghosts. He felt it in his bones long before he heard the first distant snap of a twig. 3 of them, maybe more, moving up the gulch trail below his ridge. They weren't moving fast, but they weren't being cautious either. They moved with the lazy arrogance of men who believe they own every inch of ground they walk on. Nora was brushing down the mule they kept tethered near the lean-to when Taza emerged from the trees, his face a grim, unreadable mask. She saw the look in his eyes, and her blood ran cold. She didn't have to ask. "They're coming," she stated, her voice flat. He gave a single, sharp nod. She didn't cry. She didn't panic. She simply turned, walked back towards the cave, pulled on her sturdy boots, and wrapped her shawl tightly around her shoulders. "Then let's meet them standing," she said, her voice trembling slightly, but her jaw set with a stubborn resolve. But Taza shook his head. "No, there's a goat path behind the ridge. It goes down through the shale. You take it, now." "I'm not leaving you," she said, her voice rising. His jaw tightened. "They're not coming to talk, Nora." "Then I won't speak," she shot back, stepping closer to him, her eyes flashing with a fire he hadn't seen before. "You don't understand what they are." "I do," she said, her voice cracking but not breaking. "I know exactly who sent them, and I know what I used to be." She took a deep breath. He doesn't get to own my ending, too. Taza stared at her for a long, silent moment. Her hands were trembling, but her spine was straight as a steel rod. From the trees below, a sharp whistle cut through the air. It was meant to sound like a bird, but it was too sharp, too human. A signal. Taza's head snapped around, instantly alert. Just then, 2 more riders appeared, not from the gulch, but from the south trail. They were riding hard. It was Daw Trent and his wife, Mumble, their faces etched with urgency. "They're close!" Daw shouted as they reined in their horses. "The Baron's men! Bo Finch is leading them. He's got 2 others with him. They've already lit torches." Mbell's fierce gaze landed on Nora. "You sure you want to be standing here when they crest that ridge, girl?" Nora looked from Imble's determined face to Taza's grim one, and then back down the trail where the enemy was advancing. She nodded once. "I'm done running." Imble leaned down from her saddle and tossed a heavy canvas satchel at Nora's feet. "Then at least wear this. It ain't fine blue silk, but it's honest." Inside was a plain, homespun cotton blouse, a heavy wool skirt, and a simple brown shawl. The clothes of a homesteader. The clothes of a woman who belonged to no one but herself. Taza led her to the edge of the clearing, a natural precipice where the trees gave way to a sheer, rocky bluff. Below them, through the morning mist, 3 figures on horseback rode into view. Bo Finch was in the lead, a rifle resting across his lap, his lips split in a familiar sunburnt smirk. When they saw Taza and Nora standing on the bluff, waiting for them, Bo raised a hand, halting his men. "Well, I'll be," his voice echoed up the canyon wall, laced with cruel amusement. "The Baron was starting to think you might be dead, Miss Vexley. Guess some weeds are just too stubborn to die." Nora didn't flinch. Her voice, when she answered, was clear and cold as the mountain air. "I'm not his anything." Bo let out a harsh laugh. "Always were a stubborn one. I remember that time you tried to run off when you were 12. Your daddy put a ring of ash around the house and told you if you crossed it, he'd let the dogs have you." Nora lifted her chin, her eyes blazing. "And now," she said, her voice ringing with newfound strength, "I've crossed worse things than ash." Taza stepped forward, positioning himself slightly in front of her. He was a silent, imposing figure, his stillness more menacing than any weapon. Bo's eyes flicked to him, a sneer twisting his lips. "And you, Ghost Elk, you even know who you're harboring?" "She's here," Taza said, his voice a low, dangerous rumble. "Because the snow would have killed her." "Don't dress it up as mercy," Bo spat. "You're keeping the Baron's property. In this territory, that makes you a thief, and maybe a traitor." "She is not his," Taza said, each word landing like a stone. Bo's smirk vanished. He lifted his rifle, his movements slow and deliberate, but he didn't aim it at Taza. He aimed it directly at Nora. "She belongs to Stillwater," he snarled. "She belongs to her blood." But before he could squeeze the trigger, a loud crack echoed from the trees above them. A puff of dirt exploded near Beau's horse, sending the animal skittering back in terror. It was Embel Trent. She sat on her horse, a small revolver held steady in her hand, smoke curling from the barrel. "You fire that rifle, Beau Finch!" she called out, her voice ringing with cold fury. "And the next bullet goes through your throat." Beau cursed, swinging his rifle toward the trees, but Daw Trent spurred his horse forward, his own pistol drawn. "Think carefully, Beau," Daw said, his voice calm but firm. "We all remember what Taza did for my boy. You want to make this a fight? You'll find it ain't just the Apache you're fighting today." Beau's men exchanged nervous glances. This wasn't the easy job they'd been paid for. "She's a Baron's daughter!" Beau yelled, his voice cracking with frustration. "No," Nora said, her voice cutting through the tension. She stepped out from behind Taza. "I was." She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small, intricately carved bead. With steady hands, she walked to Taza and tied the bead onto his medicine bundle, adding her own story to his. "This one," she said, her voice loud enough for every man below to hear, "is not for sorrow. It's for choosing." Taza looked at her, and in that moment, something profound passed between them. He turned back to Beau, his gaze like flint. "Ride down," he said, his voice leaving no room for argument. "Or stay here and be buried. The choice is yours. But know this hill will not hide your lies." Beau's knuckles were white on the stock of his rifle. For a long, tense moment, no one moved. Then, with a final muttered curse, he lowered the weapon. "This ain't over," he snarled. "The Baron will want what's his." Taza took another step forward, his shadow falling long across the rocky ground. "Then let him come." Beau wheeled his horse around and galloped back down the trail, his two hired guns scrambling to follow. When they were gone, a heavy silence fell over the bluff. Then Mbel dismounted and strode over to Nora, pulling her into a fierce, rough hug. "You're fireborn now, girl," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "Ain't no man's leash ever gonna hold you again." Nora smiled, a real, genuine smile, and though her lip was cracked and bleeding from the cold, her eyes were brighter and clearer than they had ever been. That night, the fire in the cave danced higher and brighter than ever before. Taza carved a second medicine bundle, smaller than his own, and handed it to her. "For your own story," he said simply. She held it in her hands as if it were the most precious thing in the world. What if I don't know what to put in it yet?" "You will," he said, his eyes meeting hers across the flames. "In time, the fire tells you." Far below, in his cold, empty mansion, Baron Vexley sat alone in the dark, the rhythmic tapping of his silver-headed cane on the floorboards the only sound. It sounded like a funeral drum. And up on the mountain, two people sat side by side, watching the fire paint their future on the ancient walls of the cave. They weren't lovers, not yet. They were something else. They were survivors. They were firewalkers, and they would never have to walk alone again. The night after the confrontation sank like a stone into a deep, dark well. In the cave, the fire burned low, casting long, flickering shadows that danced like ghosts on the rock. Neither Taza nor Nora slept. The air between them was thick, not with tension, but with the heavy certainty that comes after a battle is won, and the chilling realization that the war is far from over. Taza sat cross-legged, his focus absolute. He was grinding colored minerals in a hollowed-out stone, ochre for red, soot for black, mixing them with animal fat to create paint. His fingers were stained with the earthy pigments, making him look like a man born of the clay itself. Across the fire, Nora held the new, empty medicine bundle he had made for her. She ran her fingers over the soft, supple leather, tracing the intricate knots he had tied. Each knot, she was beginning to realize, was a word in a language she was only just starting to learn. "When you ran," Taza asked, his voice a low rumble that didn't break the quiet, "what did you hope would happen?" She didn't answer right away. She stared into the glowing embers, as if the answer was written there in the dying flames. "I didn't hope," she said finally, her voice barely a whisper. "I just ran. Hope was a luxury I couldn't afford." He nodded slowly, not in agreement, but in acknowledgement. He understood. "Hope comes later," he said, his eyes dark and knowing. "It comes after you've survived the pain you chose." She looked up, startled by his insight. It was as if he could see the tangled, broken landscape of her past. "Is that what you did?" she asked. "When you left your people?" A shadow passed over his face. "I didn't leave," he said, his voice flat and hard. "They were taken. What was left, the army called it surrender. My people, we called it survival." She touched a small, spiral-shaped carving she had tied to her own bundle earlier. "And this thing you taught me to carve? What does this spiral mean?" A faint, sad smile touched his lips. "That one is for turning back on yourself, for when you think you've gone too far, but you still find the strength to keep walking forward." Suddenly, the wind outside shifted. It was no longer the mournful howl of a lonely night. It was an angry, snarling sound. The branches of the pines scraped against the rock face like bony claws trying to get in. And the wind carried a new scent, one that didn't belong on his mountain. Lamp oil, the sweat of nervous horses, and cold iron. Taza was on his feet in an instant, all traces of the quiet philosopher gone, replaced by the lethal stillness of a predator. He grabbed his bow from the wall, stringing it in one fluid, silent motion. He slung a quiver of arrows over his shoulder. Nora's heart hammered against her ribs. She scrambled to her feet. "How many?" she whispered, her voice tight with fear. "4," he said, his eyes scanning the darkness outside the cave. "Maybe more. It's not Bo this time." He didn't have to say the name. They both knew. He grabbed a sack and shoved it into her hands. "Clothes, water. Go to the lean-to. Stay there. Don't make a sound until I come for you." "I won't leave you," she cried, grabbing his arm. "I'm not asking," he said. There was no anger in his voice, but there was a finality that was as absolute as the mountain itself. She swallowed the lump in her throat, pulled her shawl tight around her, and slipped out the back of the cave, melting into the shadows. From the ridge line, a series of yellow lights flickered to life. Torches. They moved in a wide, organized formation, flanking the clearing. This wasn't a clumsy posse of hired guns. This was a hunt. And at the center of the hunters rode a figure on a tall, black horse. He wore a long, dark coat that trailed behind him like a funeral banner. Even from a distance, Nora could feel the suffocating weight of his presence. Baron Horace Vexley had come himself. He reined in his horse at the edge of the clearing, his eyes like chips of ice, scanning the scene. "She's here," he said to Bo Finch, who rode beside him, a bandage wrapped clumsily around his thigh. "I can smell her disobedience on the wind." Bo nodded grimly. "The cave is dark, Baron, but that lean-to is new. She can't be far." Vexley's thin lips twisted into a cruel smile. "Burn it," he said, his voice soft, almost casual. Bo blinked. "Sir? I said burn it all," Vexley repeated, his voice dropping to a terrifying hiss. "The lean-to, the cave, everything. If she walks out of the flames, she's mine again. And if she doesn't," he shrugged, "then she was never worthy of the Vexley name to begin with." Bo hesitated for only a second before turning to give the order. Men dismounted, flasks of oil were uncorked. A torch was lit, its flame a hungry orange tongue in the darkness. But before they could throw it, a figure stepped out of the mouth of the cave. Taza. He just appeared, stepping from the deep shadow into the torchlight as if he belonged there, as if the fire itself had birthed him. The men froze, their hands hovering in mid-air. Baron Vexley dismounted slowly, his silver-headed cane tapping against the frozen ground. "So," he said, his voice dripping with aristocratic contempt, "this is the infamous ghost elk." Taza didn't move a muscle. "You lost something," he said, his voice a low, rumbling challenge. Vexley laughed, a short, sharp bark of a sound that held no humor. Everything under my roof is my property, and what escapes, I fetch. That is the way of the world, savage. Taza tilted his head. Then maybe your roof is too small. Bo raised his rifle, but Vexley held up a hand, stopping him. No, let him speak. Let the wild man spit his pathetic little riddles, and then we will end this. Taza took one step forward. Behind him, a stray spark from one of the torches caught on the dry pine needles of the lean-to. Flames erupted, casting his shadow long and menacing, making it dance like a vengeful spirit. She's not the woman who ran from you, Taza said, his voice ringing with power. She's been carved by this mountain, by the cold, by the truth, and by her own 2 hands. Vexley scoffed. And what has your precious truth bought you? A cold cave, a life of silence, and the pity of broken white women. Peace, Taza said, the single word a stark contrast to the Baron's venom. The Baron's face contorted in a mask of rage. He drew a polished pistol from his coat. Then die with it, he hissed. A shot rang out, but it wasn't from the Baron's gun. From the dark woods to the side of the clearing, a pistol cracked. Once, then twice. The first bullet tore through Bo Finch's shoulder, sending him screaming to the ground. The second shattered the lantern held by another rider, showering the dry brush with burning oil. The clearing exploded into chaos. Horses screamed and reared. Men shouted in confusion. Taza loosed an arrow, a silent blur of motion that found its mark in the chest of one of the Baron's men. Vexley, his face a mask of disbelief and fury, aimed his pistol towards the trees where the shots had come from, but Nora was already moving. Hidden behind a large boulder, her heart pounding, her pistol shaking in her hand, she had changed the fight. Taza didn't hesitate. He charged forward, not with the wild rage of an animal, but with the focused, unstoppable force of a storm. He slammed into the Baron, knocking the man to the ground with a single powerful blow. He stood over the fallen aristocrat, his bow drawn back, the arrowhead aimed directly at Vexley's throat. Shoot, the Baron hissed, blood trickling from his lip. Do it! Be the monster they all say you are! Taza held the pose for a long, breathless moment. Then, slowly, he lowered the bow. You don't deserve a warrior's death, he said, his voice filled with a cold contempt. You don't even deserve a song. Vexley spat on the ground. This changes nothing. I'll come again. Taza looked past him, toward the trees. Nora stepped out from behind the boulder, dust and smoke smudging her face, her hair wild around her shoulders, the pistol still held steady in her hand. No, she said, her voice clear and strong. You won't. She walked across the clearing and knelt beside her father. He stared up at her, but he didn't see the frightened girl who had fled his house. He saw a stranger, a woman with fire in her eyes and steel in her voice. You were right about one thing, father, she whispered, her voice laced with ice. You do create monsters. You just never imagined one would have the courage to walk away from you. She stood up, turning her back on him. Go home, she said, the words a dismissal, a final severing. Whatever that word even means to you now. Vexley stared at her, his face a mixture of shock and dawning horror. Without another word, he scrambled to his feet, mounted his horse, and rode away into the darkness, his remaining men trailing after him like beaten dogs. When the smoke finally cleared, and the last echo of the hoofbeats faded, Nora's strength gave out. She sank to her knees, the pistol falling from her numb fingers. Before she could hit the ground, Taza was there, catching her, holding her steady. They didn't speak. They didn't need to. In the shared silence, surrounded by the ashes of their past, they both knew that everything had changed. When the sun finally rose, painting the smoke-filled sky with pale shades of pink and gray, they stood together at the mouth of the cave, not hiding, not waiting, just breathing, just alive. And for the first time, they were truly free to choose what came next. Spring arrived quietly that year, a secret whispered on the wind after a long, hard winter. The The snow melted from the high peaks, bleeding life back into the valley. The streams ran full and wild, and the frozen earth softened, turning a rich, dark brown. The river that snaked below the bluff was no longer a snarling beast of ice. It was a ribbon of shimmering gold, its surface reflecting the bright promise of the morning sun. Taza stood at its edge, his sleeves rolled up to his elbows, heaving heavy stones from the bank. He was building a small footbridge, his movements slow, patient, and powerful. Behind him, nestled in a grove of pines, a cabin was taking shape. The walls were framed, the roof half-finished. It was little more than a skeleton, but it was shelter. It was a foundation, and it was theirs. Nora emerged from the woods, a basket filled with morel mushrooms and wild garlic slung over her arm. She wore a patched wool skirt and boots that were worn soft with use. Her hair, no longer the color of pristine gold, was streaked with darker shades from the sun and tied back in a simple, practical braid. The fear had gone from her eyes, replaced by a calm, steady fire. She walked to the edge of the stream and knelt to wash the dirt from her hands, gasping as the icy water bit at her skin. She welcomed the feeling. "They say in town that the river turns to gold at dusk," she murmured, watching the current swirl around her fingers. Taza didn't look up from his work. "Depends on the sky," he said, his voice a low rumble. "Some days it just looks like fire." "Isn't it the same thing?" she asked, a small smile playing on her lips. "Gold or fire? Something beautiful, something worth chasing." He placed the last stone in the foundation of the bridge, then wiped his hands on his trousers, and finally turned to face her. "Only if you know how to carry it without getting burned." Her smile faded, and her throat tightened. "You think I carry things well?" He looked at her, his dark eyes serious. "You don't drop them," he said simply, "even when they're on fire." The world had shifted since the night her father had ridden away in defeat. Baron Vexley had not returned. Rumors slithered out of his estate like smoke from a dying fire, tales of sickness, of a mind unraveling, of a man who now locked himself in his grand manor and spoke only to ghosts. The town of Stillwater was changing too, but more slowly. Some folks still averted their eyes when Nora passed, their whispers like the hiss of snakes. But Imbel Trent now called her friend. And the Trents were not the only ones who had been touched by the fire on the mountain. Just a week ago, Nora had helped deliver a baby for a rancher's wife on the far side of the valley, a woman too poor and too scared to send for the town doctor. The child had been born blue and still, but Nora, with a calm she didn't know she possessed, had breathed life back into its tiny lungs. When she had returned to the half-built cabin that night, she found a new bead tied to her medicine bundle. It was a smooth piece of pine, and Taza had carved a single perfect feather into it. She never asked him what it meant. She didn't have to. Now, beside the river, she stood up and walked toward him. "There's a man in town," she said, her voice steady and confident. "He's rebuilding the old mill. Mebel says he's paying 2 coins a day for strongbacks. We could trade our work for the lumber we need to finish the roof." Taza raised an eyebrow. "You want to go ask him for work?" "No," she corrected gently. "I want to go tell him that we build things better than we break them." He considered this for a long moment, his eyes scanning her face, seeing the woman she had become. He nodded once. "We'll ride at first light." A comfortable silence fell between them, filled only by the low murmur of the river and the distant tap-tap-tapping of a woodpecker. "After the cabin is finished," Taza said suddenly, his voice quiet, "I'll build a porch." She turned to him, a slow, radiant smile spreading across her face. "A porch," she added, her voice soft, "with a roof wide enough for 2 chairs, somewhere to sit and watch the storms roll in." He didn't smile, but something in his eyes eased, a tension he had carried for years finally letting go. That night, they sat by the fire outside their unfinished home, watching the last streaks of daylight fade from the sky. Taza played a slow, haunting melody on a cedar flute he had carved, and Nora hummed along, her voice weaving in and out of his. They didn't speak of the past or the future, of names or debts. They just shared the warmth, the quiet of the woods, and the company of the stars. As the darkness settled around them like a soft blanket, she reached into her pocket. She pulled out a tiny carving she had been working on for days, a bead shaped like a doorway. She knelt by his medicine bundle, which lay on a log beside him. With gentle fingers, she untied the leather cord and added her bead to the collection of his memories, the black stone for his brother, the feather for a life saved, and now, her doorway. "This one isn't for sorrow either," she whispered. "It's for what comes after you walk through the fire." He stopped playing the flute. He reached out and took her hand. His touch was not rough, not a claim, but an offering, a promise. And they sat like that for a long, long time, their hands clasped together, until the fire burned down to nothing but glowing coals. When dawn broke, they rode together toward Stillwater. Two riders, their pace unhurried, their shadows stretching long behind them on the dusty road. Their story wasn't over. It was just beginning. Sometimes a man opens his door to a stranger, a girl with cinders in her hair and a storm in her eyes. He thinks he is offering a single night of shelter from the cold. He doesn't realize he is opening the door to his own future. He doesn't understand that the thing he thinks he is saving will, in the end, be the very thing that saves him. And maybe, just maybe, that's what love really is. Not a lightning strike, not a raging fire, but a quiet, steady warmth that helps you build a home in the ruins of your past. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more tales from the shadows.